In the late summer of 2017, the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana were a tapestry of deep greens and granite grays, a rugged and unforgiving wilderness that promised solitude to those brave enough to seek it. For twin brothers Ethan and Samuel Vance, it was more than a promise. It was an annual pilgrimage. At 28 years old, they were the picture of responsible adventurers. Ethan, a geologist with a patient and analytical mind, saw the mountains as a living textbook of deep time, a story told in strata and stone. Samuel, a professional wilderness guide and emergency medical technician, saw the same landscape as a dynamic system of risks and resources, a place to be respected but never feared. Their shared expertise made them a formidable pair, their identical features and deep, unspoken bond a source of comfort to their mother, Eleanor, who had long ago accepted their need for the wild. Their yearly trip was a ritual, a week-long immersion into the backcountry to disconnect from the modern world and reconnect with each other. This year, they had planned a particularly ambitious route, a 50-mile loop through a remote, seldom-traveled section of the national forest, a challenging trek that would take them over 2 high mountain passes and along the spine of a craggy, windswept ridge. The plan was meticulously laid out, as was their custom. On August 14th, Ethan and Samuel spread a topographical map across their mother's kitchen table, tracing the intended path with a finger. They pointed out their planned campsites, their emergency bailout routes, and the designated days they would be in specific drainages. Eleanor Vance listened patiently, her maternal anxiety a low hum beneath a surface of pride. She had raised them to be self-reliant, and they had never given her a reason to doubt their capabilities. They packed with precision, their backpacks containing a carefully curated selection of lightweight gear, high-energy food for 7 days, a satellite messenger for emergency use only, and redundant navigation tools. Their clothing was layered and technical, chosen to handle the Bitterroots' notoriously fickle weather, which could swing from scorching sun to freezing sleet in a matter of hours. They assured their mother they would activate the satellite device only in a true life-or-death situation, preferring to rely on their own skills. Their expected date of return was set for the afternoon of August 21st, a Monday. They promised to call her the moment they had cell service, likely from the small town of Darby, before making the 2-hour drive home to Missoula. On the morning of August 15th, they departed. The last confirmed sighting of the Vance brothers was at a gas station on the edge of the wilderness. The clerk, a man named Henderson who had worked the same early morning shift for 2 decades, later recalled their easy confidence. He testified that they bought 2 bottles of water and a bag of jerky, paid with cash, and spoke about the clear weather forecast. They seemed relaxed, he noted, and perfectly prepared. There was nothing in their demeanor to suggest anything other than a routine departure for a well-planned adventure. At 7:42 a.m., Eleanor received a final text message from Samuel's phone. It was simple and reassuring. At the trailhead. Weather is perfect. Love you. See you in a week. A photograph was attached, a selfie of the 2 brothers standing in front of their dusty Ford Ranger, the trailhead sign visible over their shoulders. They were smiling, the early morning sun casting long shadows behind them, the vast, silent forest looming like a dark sea at their backs. It was the last image ever taken of them together, the last communication anyone would receive. For the next 7 days, as far as the outside world was concerned, Ethan and Samuel Vance were simply off the grid, executing their plan in the silent heart of the mountains. The afternoon of Monday, August 21st, came and went. Eleanor Vance kept her phone by her side, her eyes straying to it every few minutes. She told herself they were probably running a few hours late, perhaps delayed by a particularly challenging section of the trail, or simply savoring their final moments of solitude. By evening, a knot of unease had tightened in her stomach. It was unlike them to be so far off schedule without a word. She knew that once they reached their vehicle, the first thing they would do was drive towards the nearest town to get service and call. As darkness fell and the hours ticked past midnight, her unease curdled into genuine fear. She paced the floors of her quiet house, the topographical map still spread on her kitchen table, a silent testament to a plan that was now dangerously askew. She called their phones repeatedly, the calls going straight to voicemail, a recorded message in their identical voices that now sounded like a ghostly echo from a world away. She considered calling the authorities then and there, but a sliver of doubt held her back. She didn't want to overreact, to set off a massive alarm for what might be a simple delay. She decided to wait until morning, a decision she would later describe as the longest and most agonizing night of her life. On the morning of Tuesday, August 22nd, with still no word from her sons, Eleanor Vance's composure finally broke. At 8 a.m. sharp, she contacted the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office and officially filed a missing persons report. She spoke with a calm, measured voice, providing the dispatcher with every detail of her son's itinerary, their experience level, their gear, and a precise description of their vehicle. Her control was a thin veneer over a well of rising panic. The case was assigned to Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison, a veteran lawman with over 30 years of experience. Many of them spent coordinating search and rescue operations in the very wilderness where the Vance brothers had disappeared. Morrison was a man who understood the mountains and the many ways they could claim the unwary. Yet, as he reviewed the initial report, something felt off. The Vance twins were not inexperienced tourists. They were seasoned experts. Their disappearance, without any distress signal from their satellite device, was immediately classified as highly unusual and of grave concern. The first official step was to locate their vehicle. Deputy Morrison dispatched a patrol car to the remote trailhead, a bumpy, unpaved road that snaked deep into the national forest. At 11:15 a.m., the deputy confirmed the presence of the blue Ford Ranger, exactly where the brothers' final photo had shown it. The discovery, however, only deepened the mystery. The truck was locked and undisturbed. Peering through the windows, the deputy could see two wallets sitting on the center console, containing their driver's licenses and credit cards. Their cell phones were also there, powered off to conserve their batteries for the return trip. On the passenger seat sat a half-eaten bag of trail mix and two empty water bottles. The scene painted a clear and chilling picture. Ethan and Samuel had left their vehicle with the full intention of returning. They had not planned to be gone long enough to warrant taking their wallets or phones. This was not the vehicle of two men who had voluntarily walked away from their lives. It was the starting point of a journey that had gone terribly, inexplicably wrong. The undisturbed state of the truck offered no clues, only a silent, ominous confirmation that the brothers had entered the forest as planned and had not come out. With the vehicle confirmed, a large-scale search operation was immediately mobilized. By the afternoon of August 22nd, the trailhead had transformed into a bustling command post. The Ravalli County Sheriff's Office, in conjunction with the United States Forest Service, coordinated a multi-agency response that included professional search and rescue teams from across the region, dozens of trained volunteers, and specialized canine units. The air soon thrummed with the rhythmic beat of a helicopter from a nearby Air Force base, its crew tasked with providing aerial reconnaissance and deploying forward-looking infrared FLIR technology, which could detect heat signatures on the ground. Deputy Morrison, now the on-scene commander, pored over the topographical map provided by Eleanor Vance, his brow furrowed in concentration. The search area was immense, a sprawling expanse of over 100 square miles of some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain in the continental United States. The brothers' intended route provided a starting point, but the possibilities for deviation were nearly infinite. The search process was methodical and arduous. Teams of ground searchers were organized into grids, their fluorescent orange vests stark splashes of color against the deep green of the forest. They moved in slow, deliberate lines, their eyes scanning for any sign of the missing men. A piece of discarded gear, a broken branch, a footprint in a patch of soft earth. The challenges were immense. The forest canopy was so dense in many areas that it rendered aerial observation almost useless, creating a ceiling of foliage that blocked both sunlight and the view from above. The terrain itself was a formidable obstacle. Searchers had to navigate steep, scree-covered slopes, push through thickets of thorny underbrush, and cross fast-moving, ice-cold creeks. The vastness of the wilderness was palpable. A person could vanish within feet of a trail and never be seen. Every hour that passed diminished the chances of finding the brothers alive, a grim reality that hung over the command post like the ever-present mountain haze. The K-9 units, with their superior olfactory senses, represented one of the best hopes for a breakthrough. A dog handler brought one of his most experienced animals, a German shepherd named Zeus, to the Ford Ranger. After being presented with an article of Samuel's clothing provided by Eleanor, Zeus immediately picked up a scent trail. The dog led his handler away from the trailhead and onto the designated path, his tail held high, a clear indication that he was on the right track. For nearly 2 miles, the trail was strong and consistent, following the planned route precisely. The search team felt a surge of cautious optimism. This was a positive sign that the brothers had at least started their journey as intended. But then, in a wide clearing dominated by a massive, flat expanse of granite rock near a rushing creek, the trail abruptly ended. Zeus circled the area repeatedly, his nose to the ground, whining in frustration. He cast back and forth, tried to reacquire the scent, but it was gone. It was as if the brothers had simply ceased to exist at that spot. The handlers and Deputy Morrison were baffled. The granite slab offered no purchase for footprints, and the nearby creek was too shallow and swift to have carried them away without leaving some trace. The scent had vanished into thin air. It was the first truly puzzling clue in a case that would soon be defined by a complete lack of them. For 14 consecutive days, the search continued with relentless intensity. Over 200 searchers, both professional and volunteer, combed the mountainsides. The aerial teams flew countless sorties, their thermal imaging cameras scanning the landscape day and night, hoping to detect the faint heat of a campfire or a human body. Divers were even brought in to check several deep pools in the creeks along the brothers' route, but they found nothing. The ground teams meticulously searched the area around the granite slab, where the scent trail had disappeared, fanning out in ever-widening circles. They found no campsite, no fire ring, no discarded food wrappers, not a single piece of equipment. It was a pristine wilderness, wiped clean of any human presence. The only item of potential significance was discovered on day 10, a single, brightly colored energy gel packet of the brand the brothers were known to use, found lying on a log nearly 5 miles off their intended path in a completely different drainage. Yet, there was no way to definitively link it to them. Thousands of hikers used these mountains, and it could have been old litter. The discovery was logged, but it led nowhere. Another dead end in a sprawling, silent mystery. By the end of the first week of September, the grim realities of the situation began to set in. The operational costs were mounting, the volunteers were physically and emotionally exhausted, and the statistical probability of finding Ethan and Samuel alive after more than 2 weeks in the wilderness, without any contact, was plummeting toward zero. Deputy Morrison, his face etched with fatigue and frustration, had to make the difficult decision. On September 8th, a press conference was held at the command post. With Eleanor Vance standing silently beside him, her expression a mask of stoic grief, Morrison announced that the active, large-scale search operation was being officially scaled back. He explained that they had exhausted all available leads and had covered the highest probability areas multiple times. The search would not be terminated, he clarified, but would transition to a limited, continuous mode, meaning that patrols would continue on a smaller scale and the case would remain open. For the families of the missing, these are the most dreaded words, a procedural euphemism for the end of hope. The thrum of the helicopters ceased, the teams packed their gear, and an eerie quiet descended once more upon the trailhead, leaving only the Ford Ranger, now covered in a thin layer of dust and fallen pine needles, as a lonely monument to the 2 men the mountains had swallowed. Weeks turned into months, and the vibrant greens of late summer bled into the fiery oranges and yellows of autumn. The falling leaves stripped the forest of its canopy, revealing the stark, bony structure of the landscape, yet the mountains kept their secret. Winter arrived with a vengeance, draping the Bitterroots in a thick blanket of snow, burying any potential evidence under feet of impenetrable white. The passage of time was marked by the changing seasons, each one a painful reminder to Eleanor Vance of her son's absence. The official investigation stalled. Without a body, a crime scene, or any new evidence, there was little for law enforcement to do. Deputy Morrison kept the case file open on his desk, a constant, nagging presence. He would occasionally review the maps, the reports, the witness statements, searching for some detail he might have missed, some new angle to pursue. But there was nothing. The case of the Vance brothers became a local legend, a ghost story whispered around campfires, another cautionary tale of the power of the wilderness. Eleanor Vance, however, refused to let her sons be relegated to a cold case file. She became a relentless force, a mother driven by a primal need for answers. She liquidated a portion of her retirement savings to fund private searches, hiring specialized teams with cadaver dogs and advanced drone technology to scour the areas the official search might have missed. These efforts, too, yielded nothing. She established the Vance Brothers Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting the families of missing persons in wilderness areas. She maintained a social media page that provided updates on the case, shared memories of her sons, and pleaded with the public for any information. Every weekend, weather permitting, she would drive to the trailhead herself, sometimes with a small group of friends and family, and walk the first few miles of the trail, calling her sons' names into the vast, indifferent silence. Her hope was a stubborn, flickering flame against an overwhelming darkness. She refused to believe they were gone, clinging to the possibility of their survival, that they had somehow found a way to endure, a belief that most others, including the investigators, had long since abandoned. As years passed, the public's perception of the case began to shift. The initial wave of sympathy and community support gave way to speculation and unfounded theories. With no evidence of foul play or an accident, some began to whisper that the brothers had disappeared voluntarily. Perhaps they had orchestrated their own vanishing to escape some hidden debt or secret trouble. This theory, fueled by the fact that their satellite messenger was never activated, gained traction in online forums and true crime communities. It was a cruel and baseless narrative that added a layer of public suspicion to Eleanor's private grief. She was forced to publicly defend her son's characters, to push back against the painful suggestion that they would willingly inflict such suffering upon her. The official investigation, while never subscribing to this theory, had to consider all possibilities. Detectives quietly re-examined the brothers' lives, their finances, their relationships, searching for any sign of a motive for a planned escape. They found nothing. Ethan and Samuel were, by all accounts, stable, happy, and responsible young men with strong community ties and a deep love for their family. The voluntary disappearance theory was officially dismissed, but the whispers lingered, a corrosive static that complicated the pure tragedy of the family's loss. 5 years, an eternity of not knowing. The snows of 5 winters had buried the mountains, and the wildflowers of 5 springs had bloomed and withered. The Vance Brothers Foundation had grown, helping dozens of other families navigate the agonizing limbo of a missing loved one. Eleanor Vance's hair had turned a shade grayer, the lines of grief etched permanently around her eyes, but her resolve had not wavered. The case was now firmly in the realm of the cold, a tragic local mystery with no clues and no resolution. Deputy Frank Morrison had retired, passing the thick, fruitless case file to a younger detective who had no personal connection to the initial, frantic search. The blue Ford Ranger had long ago been removed from the trailhead and returned to Eleanor, where it sat in her garage, a preserved artifact from the last normal day of her life. For all practical purposes, the world had moved on. The story of the lost Vance twins had faded from the headlines, remembered only by their mother and a small circle of loyal friends. The mountains remained silent, impassive, keeping their secrets locked away in a fortress of rock and timber. Then, on the morning of August 22nd, 2022, exactly 5 years to the day that the official search had been launched, the impossible happened. On a remote, little-used logging road nearly 60 miles south of the original search area, a long-haul trucker named Al Peterson was performing a pre-trip inspection of his rig. He had pulled over for the night in a desolate turnout, the forest pressing in on all sides. As the first light of dawn filtered through the dense pines, he saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods. A figure stumbled out from between the trees, a skeletal apparition that seemed more ghost than man. The person was tall, gaunt, and covered in filth, with a matted beard and hair that hung to his shoulders. He was dressed in the tattered, threadbare remnants of what looked like modern hiking gear, clothes that were rotted and falling apart. The figure took a few halting steps onto the gravel shoulder and then collapsed. Peterson, a burly man not easily rattled, grabbed a bottle of water and a first aid kit from his cab and cautiously approached. The man on the ground was unresponsive, his breathing shallow, his skin pale and stretched taut over his bones. It was then that Peterson noticed something glinting on the man's left hand. It was a ring, crudely fashioned from what looked like braided plant fibers and a thin strip of animal hide. Believing he had found a dying vagrant, Peterson used his CB radio to call for help, his voice trembling slightly as he reported the discovery. When paramedics and sheriff's deputies from a neighboring county arrived, the man was unconscious but alive. He was severely emaciated, his body a landscape of protruding ribs and hollowed cheeks. His skin was covered in a lattice of old scars, and his bare feet were calloused and misshapen. They found no identification on him. He was carefully loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the nearest regional hospital. In the emergency room, as doctors worked to stabilize him, a nurse began the process of cleaning the grime from his body. It was then that she noticed a faint, faded tattoo on his right forearm, a detailed rendering of a trilobite fossil. An older, more experienced doctor recognized the patient's facial structure, hidden beneath the beard and emaciation. He had a vague recollection of a missing persons poster from years ago. A quick check of the National Missing Persons database, cross-referencing the tattoo, brought up a shocking result. The man on the hospital bed, clinging to life by a thread, was identified as Ethan Vance. The news sent an immediate shockwave through the law enforcement community and reached a stunned Eleanor Vance within the hour. Her son, who had been presumed dead for 5 years, had come back. The scene at the hospital was one of disbelief and cautious jubilation. Eleanor arrived in a daze, her mind struggling to process the news. When she saw her son, she barely recognized him. He was a shadow of the vibrant young man who had left 5 years earlier. He weighed less than 100 pounds, and his medical chart was a terrifying litany of afflictions: severe malnutrition, advanced dehydration, muscle atrophy, and signs of long-term vitamin deficiencies. There were old, well-healed fracture lines on several of his ribs and fingers, and most disturbingly, the attending physician noted the presence of distinct circumferential scarring around his wrists and ankles. These were ligature marks, the unmistakable signs of having been bound or chained for an extended period. And then there was the ring. It was a strange, almost ritualistic object, woven with incredible precision from willow bark and deer sinew. It was not a piece of survival gear. It was something else entirely, a bizarre and inexplicable artifact from his 5 years in the wilderness. When an FBI agent, now part of the reactivated investigation, tried to gently remove it for analysis, Ethan, though barely conscious, reflexively clenched his fist, a primal, protective gesture. The ring, for reasons unknown, was important. Ethan's reappearance instantly transformed the case. It was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was now a major federal kidnapping and probable homicide case. The central question that had haunted everyone for 5 years, what happened to the Vance brothers, now had a living witness. But where was Samuel? Ethan's initial condition was too fragile for any substantive questioning. He was placed in intensive care, where he drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering incoherent words. A joint task force was formed, bringing together the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office, the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation, and the FBI. The logging road where Ethan had been found became the epicenter of a new, massive search. But this time they were not just looking for survivors. They were looking for a crime scene. The area was a dense, trackless wilderness, even more remote than the original search location. Investigators knew they were looking for a place where someone could be held captive for 5 years, a hidden shelter, a bunker, or a remote, off-grid cabin, a place that had remained invisible to the world for half a decade. The discovery of Ethan Vance had answered one question, but it had raised 1,000 more, each one darker and more disturbing than the last. The investigation was now a race against time, a desperate effort to piece together the fragmented puzzle of Ethan Vance's ordeal while the trail to his captor and to his brother Samuel was still potentially warm. The task force was led by FBI Special Agent Isabella Rossi, a specialist in long-term abductions. Her first priority was securing any and all forensic evidence from Ethan himself. His tattered clothing, the dirt and biological matter under his fingernails, and the strange, woven ring on his finger were all collected with painstaking care. Each fiber, each pollen grain, each microscopic fleck of soil held the potential to reveal the location where he had been held captive. The ligature marks on his wrists and ankles were photographed and analyzed by forensic pathologists, who determined they were caused by prolonged restraint, likely with metal chains or cuffs. The pattern of scarring suggested he had been bound for years, not days or weeks. This was not a case of getting lost in the woods. This was a case of sustained, systematic imprisonment. While the forensic teams worked, a behavioral analysis unit from Quantico began to construct a preliminary profile of the unknown subject, or unsub, based on the location and the nature of the crime. They theorized they were looking for a highly skilled and self-sufficient individual, someone who possessed an intimate knowledge of the wilderness. This person was likely a recluse, living off the grid, and capable of moving through the rugged terrain without leaving a trace. He would be patient, methodical, and highly organized, able to maintain a hidden captive for 5 years without detection. The motive was unclear, but it did not appear to be financial or sexual in nature, based on the initial medical examination. The profile suggested a perpetrator driven by a more esoteric, psychological need, perhaps a desire for total control, or a bizarre, pseudoscientific curiosity. The unsub was a ghost, a predator who had made the vast Montana wilderness his personal hunting ground. The profile painted a chilling portrait of a man who was not just hiding in the mountains, but was a part of them. For 2 weeks, Ethan remained in the hospital, slowly regaining physical strength. His psychological state, however, was a far greater concern. He was withdrawn and mostly silent, his eyes holding a haunted, distant look. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress, flinching at loud noises and reacting with panic to being touched. A team of trauma specialists worked with him around the clock, creating a safe and quiet environment, slowly building a fragile bridge of trust. Eleanor Vance was a constant presence at his bedside, speaking to him in soft, soothing tones, holding his hand, and reminding him that he was safe. It was her voice, the familiar anchor of his past life, that finally began to break through the wall of his trauma. His first coherent words were whispered to her in the middle of the night, a single, heartbreaking question: "Is Samuel with you?" Eleanor had to deliver the devastating news that he was the only one who had come back, a truth that sent him spiraling back into a deep, silent withdrawal for several more days. Slowly, painstakingly, Ethan began to talk. His testimony, delivered over multiple sessions with Agent Rossi and a forensic psychologist, was a harrowing narrative that defied belief. He spoke in a flat, emotionless monotone, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. He described the first day of their hike, how they had stopped at the granite slab near the creek to rest. As they were drinking water, he felt a sudden, sharp sting in his neck and another in his brother's. He remembered a fleeting sense of confusion and a rapidly spreading paralysis before everything went dark. He awoke disoriented and weak, lying on a dirt floor in a dark, subterranean space. Samuel was beside him, similarly incapacitated. A man was there, a tall, sinewy figure with a weathered face and cold, pale eyes. The man never spoke a word, not once in 5 years. He moved with a silent, deliberate grace, a phantom in their waking nightmare. Ethan's description of their captivity was the stuff of grim fairy tales. They were held in what appeared to be a dugout shelter, a cleverly concealed bunker dug into the side of a hill, its entrance hidden by a seamless curtain of rock and vegetation. It was small, damp, and perpetually dark, lit only by the occasional flicker of a tallow candle. Their captor, whom Ethan and Samuel came to call the Observer, treated them not as prisoners, but as specimens in a long-term experiment. He would provide them with the bare minimum of food and water to sustain life, foraged roots, small game, and unfiltered spring water. He would take meticulous notes in a leather-bound journal, documenting their weight loss, their muscle atrophy, their psychological states. He would measure their heart rates, examine their teeth, and take samples of their hair. It was a cold, clinical, and completely detached process. He showed no anger, no malice, and no empathy. His actions were those of a researcher studying a foreign species. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. The brothers struggled to maintain their sanity in the silent, suffocating darkness. They whispered to each other, recounting memories from their childhood, testing each other with trivia, anything to keep their minds active and their bond intact. But after more than a year of malnutrition and confinement, Samuel's health began to fail. He developed a severe respiratory infection, his body too weak to fight it off. Ethan described how the Observer watched Samuel's decline with the same detached curiosity he showed everything else, documenting his fever, his labored breathing, his eventual death. When Samuel finally passed away, the Observer performed a strange, silent ritual, wrapping his body in a deerskin shroud. He then carried the body outside. Ethan, watching through a crack in a crude door, saw him bury his brother in the earth just a few feet from their prison. The next day, the Observer returned and, without expression, took Ethan's left hand and placed the woven willow ring on his finger. It was not an act of sentiment. It felt to Ethan like an act of documentation, a marker, like a biologist tagging an animal. Ethan's escape was not a feat of daring, but a product of pure chance. For 4 more years, he endured the solitary confinement, his hope dwindling to a single, faint ember. His existence was a monotonous cycle of near starvation and silent observation. Then, one day, the Observer simply did not return. A day passed, then 2, then a week. Ethan, weakened but desperate, realized that the heavy stone door to their cell had not been properly barred from the outside. The Observer, in his haste to leave for whatever reason, had made a mistake. It took Ethan 3 days of agonizing effort, using all his remaining strength, to push the stone aside just enough to squeeze through. When he emerged into the sunlight for the first time in 5 years, he was blinded and disoriented. He had no idea where he was. He only knew he had to move, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that place. He stumbled through the forest for what he thinks was several days, driven by a primal instinct for survival, until he collapsed on the side of the logging road where the trucker found him. His story, as incredible as it was, provided the investigation with its first real leads. The description of the captor, the nature of the confinement, and a potential time frame for the Observer's rare absence. The forensic analysis of the evidence collected from Ethan's body and clothing began to yield crucial results. The pollen samples found on his tattered pants belonged to a species of alpine flower that grew only in a very specific, high-altitude region of the Bitterroots, narrowing the search area significantly. The soil samples contained trace amounts of unusual minerals, consistent with the geology of that same region. But the most significant clue came from the willow ring. A botanist at the University of Montana identified the species of willow used to make it as a rare variety that thrived only along a handful of remote, spring-fed creeks. Furthermore, a forensic fiber analyst determined that the deer sinew used in the ring had been treated with a primitive brain tanning method, a highly specialized skill known to very few modern individuals. This was the work of an expert survivalist, someone who lived not just in the wilderness, but by its oldest rules. The task force now had a geographical target and a much clearer picture of the man they were hunting. Armed with Ethan's detailed description, a forensic artist created a composite sketch of the observer. The drawing depicted a man in his late 60s or early 70s, with a lean, weathered face, a prominent brow ridge, and deeply set, disturbingly vacant eyes. The sketch was circulated among local and federal law enforcement agencies, as well as to retired Forest Service and fish and game personnel. For weeks, the tip line was inundated with false leads. Then, a call came in from a retired Forest Service ranger living in a small town in Idaho. The ranger, a man named Dave Haskins, said the sketch bore a striking resemblance to a man he had worked with on a wildland firefighting crew back in the 1970s. The man's name was Silas Croft. Haskins described Croft as a legendary woodsman, the most skilled and silent man he had ever met. He was an outcast, antisocial and strange, who seemed to prefer the company of trees to people. He was eventually let go from the Forest Service for his unsettling behavior and inability to work as part of a team. Haskins recalled that Croft had inherited a remote piece of land, a mining claim deep in the mountains, somewhere in the very region the investigation was now focused on. He had not been seen or heard from in decades, and most people assumed he had died out in the woods long ago. The name Silas Croft electrified the investigation. A search of old property records confirmed that a man by that name did indeed own a 40-acre parcel of land, a patented mining claim surrounded on all sides by national forest, located in the heart of the newly defined search area. The property was incredibly remote, accessible only by a long-abandoned mining trail that was impassable to most vehicles. There were no utilities, no mailing address, no official record of him existing for over 40 years. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. Special Agent Rossi immediately began planning an operation. A covert surveillance team was dispatched, flown in by helicopter to a ridge several miles from the property. Using high-powered optics, they spent 2 days observing the parcel. On the third day, they saw him. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from a cleverly camouflaged cabin, a man who was the living embodiment of the forensic sketch. It was Silas Croft. The surveillance team watched as he went about his daily routine, moving with the quiet efficiency of a predator in his natural habitat. They also identified what appeared to be the entrance to a subterranean structure just behind the cabin, its opening concealed by a large flat rock. This was the place. The plan to apprehend Silas Croft had to be executed with surgical precision. Given his skills and the remote, defensible location of his property, a conventional approach was deemed too risky. The FBI's hostage rescue team was brought in to lead the operation. In the pre-dawn hours of October 12, 2022, 2 helicopters, flying low and without lights, inserted the tactical teams at designated points around the perimeter of Croft's property. They moved in silence, using the cover of darkness and the dense forest to establish a cordon. As the sun began to rise, a small drone was launched, providing a live aerial feed of the cabin. Croft emerged just after sunrise, unarmed, to collect water from a nearby spring. This was the moment the team had been waiting for. On Agent Rossi's command, the teams moved in. The raid was swift and overwhelming. Before Croft could react, he was surrounded, illuminated by a dozen laser sights, and ordered to the ground. He showed no surprise, no fear, and no resistance. He simply lay on the ground and placed his hands behind his back, his cold, pale eyes scanning the faces of his captors with a look of mild, academic curiosity. The ghost of the Bitterroots had been captured. The scene at Croft's property was a forensic gold mine. The main cabin was Spartan, containing only a bed, a wood stove, and shelves filled with preserved foods and handmade tools. But the real discoveries were made in the subterranean shelter behind the cabin. It was exactly as Ethan had described, a dark, reinforced dugout with chains bolted to the wall, and in the corner, a collection of leather-bound journals. Spanning over 40 years, The notebooks contained thousands of pages of Croft's meticulous, handwritten observations. The early volumes were filled with notes on animal behavior, the migration patterns of elk, the social structure of wolf packs, the way a hibernating bear's metabolism slows. But the entries from the last 5 years were different. They detailed, in cold, clinical prose, the systematic study of Ethan and Samuel Vance. Croft had logged their daily caloric intake, their weight loss, their conversations, which he had apparently listened to through a hidden tube, and their psychological decline. The final entry regarding Samuel was chillingly detached. Subject B has expired. Respiratory failure. Bond with subject A appears to be transferring to dependency on observer. It was the dispassionate record of a monster. Following the discovery of the journals, a team of forensic anthropologists was brought in to excavate the area behind the shelter where Ethan had seen his brother buried. Just a few feet beneath the soil, they unearthed human remains wrapped in a deerskin shroud. Dental records would later confirm the remains belonged to Samuel Vance. Silas Croft was transported to a federal facility and placed in an interrogation room. Agent Rossi and a senior detective from the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office conducted the interview. For hours, Croft sat in complete silence, his expression unreadable. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for water. He simply watched them. Agent Rossi decided to change tactics. She slid one of his journals across the table and opened it to an entry about the Vance brothers. "Tell me about your research," she said, her voice even. For the first time, Croft's expression changed. A flicker of something akin to pride appeared in his eyes. He began to speak, his voice a dry and used rasp. He explained that after decades of studying animals, he had grown curious about the human species, which he considered to be corrupted and weakened by civilization. He wanted to study them in their purest state, stripped of all modern comforts. The twin brothers, he explained, represented a unique opportunity to study the nature of a primal human bond under extreme, controlled duress. His confession was delivered without a hint of remorse or emotion. He viewed the kidnapping and Samuel's subsequent death not as a crime, but as the unfortunate but necessary cost of data collection. He had no hatred for the brothers. In his mind, they were no different from the animals he had trapped and studied his entire life. They were objects of scientific inquiry. When asked about the ring, he explained it was a marker. When one of a bonded pair dies in the wild, he stated, his voice a dry whisper, the survivor is changed. It becomes a new entity. I was marking the transition. He admitted he had left his camp for an extended period because a large forest fire in a neighboring state had created a rare opportunity for him to scavenge for unique fire-fused minerals, a geological obsession that had momentarily outweighed his interest in his human subjects. It was this singular, selfish lapse in his routine that had allowed Ethan to escape. His motive was a chilling cocktail of intellectual arrogance and a profound, pathological disconnect from humanity. He was not insane in a legal sense. He was something far more terrifying, a man who had logically reasoned his way into becoming a monster. The trial of Silas Croft was held in the federal courthouse in Missoula. It was a somber and media-saturated affair. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office, built an overwhelming case. They presented the forensic evidence from the compound, the DNA match of Samuel's remains, and Croft's own damning journals, which were read aloud to a stunned and horrified courtroom. Croft himself remained impassive throughout the proceedings, observing the trial with the same detached curiosity he had shown his victims. The emotional centerpiece of the trial was the testimony of Ethan Vance. Taking the stand, he recounted his 5-year ordeal in a clear, steady voice. He looked directly at Croft, who met his gaze without flinching. For the first time, Ethan's voice filled with emotion as he described his brother's final days, his words painting a devastating picture of suffering and loss. The jury was visibly moved. His testimony, combined with the mountain of physical evidence, left no room for doubt. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury returned with a verdict. They found Silas Croft guilty on all counts, 2 counts of kidnapping resulting in death, and one count of premeditated murder. At the sentencing hearing a month later, Ethan and his mother both provided victim impact statements. Eleanor spoke of the two bright lights that had been extinguished from her life, of the 5 years of agonizing uncertainty, and of the profound, unending grief of losing a child. Ethan spoke of the brother he had lost and the life that had been stolen from him. When asked if he had anything to say, Silas Croft simply stood and said, "The data is incomplete." It was his final, chilling statement, a confirmation of his complete lack of humanity. The judge, calling his crimes an offense against the very concept of civilization, sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 20 years. He was sent to a maximum security federal penitentiary, where he would live out the rest of his days in a cell, a place of confinement not unlike the one he had built for his victims. In the years that followed, Ethan Vance began the long and arduous process of recovery. The physical scars faded, but the psychological wounds ran deep. He worked extensively with therapists to process the immense trauma and grief. He never returned to his work as a geologist. The thought of being alone in the wilderness was now unbearable. Instead, he dedicated his life to his mother's foundation. He became a powerful advocate for the families of the missing, his story a testament to the extremes of human endurance and the importance of never giving up hope. The Vance Brothers Foundation grew into a national organization, creating new protocols for long-term missing person cases and providing crucial funding for search and rescue teams across the country. The case itself led to changes in how law enforcement investigated disappearances in wilderness areas, emphasizing the need to consider the possibility of criminal abduction even in the absence of direct evidence. The story of Ethan and Samuel Vance became a permanent part of the lore of the American West, a harrowing narrative of survival and loss. It serves as a stark reminder that the greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the elements or the wildlife. Sometimes the deepest and most impenetrable darkness resides not in the shadowed canyons or the dense forests, but within the hidden corners of the human heart. It is a story about the profound resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable bond between 2 brothers, and the enduring strength of a mother's love, which refused to be extinguished even in the face of 5 years of silent, agonizing night. The mountains remain, their granite peaks indifferent to the human dramas that unfold in their shadows. But for those who know the story, the silence of the Bitterroots will forever carry the echo of a ghost and the quiet courage of the one who came back.